Alright guys, we're on chapter 14 of The Painted Bird. I woke on a wide low bed nestled against the wall and covered with sheepskins. It was hot in the room and the flickering light of a thick candle revealed a dirt floor, chalky white walls and a thatched roof. A cross hung from the chimney piece. A woman sat staring into the high flames in the oven. She was barefoot in a tight skirt of coarse linen. Her jerkin of rabbit pelts with many holes was unbuttoned to the waist. Noticing that I was awake, she approached and sat down on the bed, which groaned under her weight. She lifted my chin and looked attentively at me. Her eyes were watery blue. When she smiled, she did not cover her mouth with her hand, as was customary here. Instead, she displayed 2 rows of yellowish, uneven teeth. She spoke to me in a local dialect, which I could not fully understand. She persisted in calling me her poor gypsy, her little Jewish foundling. At first, she would not believe that I was a mute. Occasionally she looked inside my mouth, rapped my throat, tried to startle me, but soon she stopped when I stayed silent. She fed me hot, thick borscht and carefully inspected my frozen ears, hands, and feet. She told me her name was Labina. I felt safe and contented with her. I liked her very much. In the daytime, Labina went out to work as a domestic to some of the richer peasants, especially to those with sick wives or too many children. Often she took me along so I could have a decent meal. Although it was said in the village that I should be delivered to the Germans, Labina replied to such remarks with a torrent of curses, shouting that all were equal before God and that she was no Judas to sell their neighbor for silver coins. In the evenings, Labina used to receive guests in her hut. Men who managed to get out of their houses came to her hut with bottles of vodka and baskets of food. Probably a whore. The hut contained a single enormous bed that could easily accommodate 3 people. Between one edge of this bed and the wall, there was a wide space where Labina had piled sacks, old rags, and sheepskins, thus providing me with a place to sleep. I always went to sleep before the guests arrived, but I was often awakened by their singing and boisterous toasts. But I pretended to be asleep. I did not wish to risk the beating Labina often half-heartedly said I deserved. With eyes nearly closed, I would watch what was happening in the room. A drinking bout would begin and last far into the night. Usually one man would stay after the others had left. He and Labina would sit down against the warm oven and drink from the same cup. When she would sway uncertainly and lean toward the man, he would place a huge blackened hand on her flabby thighs and slowly move it under her skirt. Labina at first acted indifferent, then struggled a little. The man's other hand slid from beneath her neck down inside her blouse. At times the man kneeled on the floor and pushed his face aggressively into her groin, biting it through the skirt while squeezing her buttocks with both hands. Often he would strike her groin abruptly with the edge of his hand, and she would bend over and moan. The candle was put out. They would undress in the dark, laughing and cursing, stumbling over the furniture and each other, impatiently shedding their clothing, overturning bottles that would roll across the room. When they tumbled onto the bed, I feared it would collapse. While I thought of the rats who lived with us, Labina and her guests tossed about in the bed, wheezing and fighting, calling on God and Satan, the man howling like a dog, the woman grunting like a pig. Often, in the middle of the night, in the midst of my dreams, I suddenly awoke on the floor between the bed and the wall. The bed quivered above me, shifted by the body, struggling in convulsive fits, finally began to move over the tilted floor toward the center of the room. Unable to crawl back into the bed from which I fell, I had to crawl under it and push it back against the wall. Then I returned to my pallet. The dirt floor under the bed was cold and moist and covered with cat feces and the remains of birds they had dragged in. As I crawled in the dark, I tore at thick cobwebs and the frightened spiders ran over my face and hair. Warm little bodies of mice fled to their holes, brushing against me as they passed. Touching this dark world with my naked body always filled me with revulsion and fear. I would crawl out from under the bed, wipe the cobwebs off my face, and wait shivering for the proper moment to push it back toward the wall. Gradually my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I looked on while the great sweating body of the man mounted the trembling woman. She embraced his fleshy buttocks with her legs, which resembled the wings of a bird crushed under a stone. The peasant groaned and sighed heavily, gathered up the woman's body under his hands, raised himself, and with the back of his hand struck her breasts. They flapped loudly like a wet cloth being beaten against a rock. They swooped down on her and nailed her motionless to the bed. Labina, crying incoherently, struck his back with her hands. I looked on with disappointment and disgust at the 2 intertwined, twitching human frames. So that's what love was, savage as a bull prodded with a spike, brutal, smelly, sweaty. This love was like a brawl in which man and woman wrested pleasure from each other. fighting, incapable of thought, half-stunned, panting, less than human. I recalled the moments I had passed with Uka, how differently I treated her. My touch was gentle, my hands, my mouth, my tongue hovered consciously over her skin, soft and delicate like gossamer floating in windless warm air. I continually sought out new sensitive places unknown even to her, bringing them to life with my touch as rays of sunshine revive a butterfly chilled by the cool air of the night. I remembered my elaborate efforts and how they released within the girl's body some yearnings and tremors that otherwise would have been imprisoned there forever. I liberated them, wanting her only to find pleasure in herself. The loves of Labina and her guests were soon over. They were like short spring thunder showers that wet the leaves and grass but never reached the roots. I remembered how my games with Uka never really ceased but only dimmed when Makar and Quail intruded into our lives. They continued long into the night like a peat fire whipped gently by the wind. Yet even this love was extinguished as fast as burning logs are smothered with a shepherd's horse blanket. As soon as I became temporarily incapable of playing with her, Uka forgot me. To the warmth of my body, the tender caress of my arms, the gentle touch of my fingers in my mouth, she preferred a stinking hairy goat and his loathsome deep penetration. Finally, the bed stopped quivering and the slackened carcasses sprawling there like slaughtered cattle settled into sleep. Then I pushed the bed back to the wall, climbed over it, and lay down in my cold corner, pulling all the sheepskins over me. On rainy afternoons, Labina grew melancholic and talked about her husband, Laba, who was no longer alive. Many years ago, Labina had been a beautiful girl whom the richest peasants wooed, but against reasoned advice, she fell in love with and married Laba, the poorest farmhand in the village, known also as the Handsome One. Laba indeed was handsome, tall as a poplar, nimble as a top. His hair shone in the sun, his eyes were bluer than the fairest sky, and his complexion was as smooth as a child's. When he looked at a woman, her blood ran fire and lustful thoughts raced through her head. Laba knew that he was good-looking and that he aroused admiration and lust in women. He liked to parade about the woods and bathe in the pond naked. He would glance into the bushes and know that he was being watched by young virgins and married women. But he was the poorest farmhand in the village. He was hired by rich peasants and had to endure many humiliations. These men knew that Laba was desired by their wives and daughters, and they would humble him for it. They also bothered Labina, knowing that her penniless husband depended on them and could only look on helplessly. One summer day, Laba did not return home from the field. He did not return the next day or the day after. He vanished like a stone dropped to the bottom of a lake. It was thought that he was drowned or sucked in by a swamp, or that some jealous suitor had knifed him and buried him at night in the forest. Life went on without Laba. Only the sane, handsome as Laba, survived in the village. A lonely year without Laba passed. People forgot him, and only Labina believed that he was still alive and would return. One summer day, when the villagers rested in the short shadows of the trees, a cart pulled by a fat horse emerged from the forest. On the cart lay a large chest covered by a cloth, and next to it walked handsome Laba in a beautiful leather jacket slung hussar fashion over his shoulders and trousers of the finest cloth and tall shining boots. Jesus Christ. That's a beautiful girl over there. On the cart lay a large chest covered by a cloth, and next to it walked handsome Laba, so he actually returned. The children ran among the huts carrying the news, and men and women swarmed toward the road. Laba greeted them all with a nonchalant wave while wiping the sweat off his brow and prodding the horse. Labina was already waiting in the doorway. He kissed his wife, unloaded the enormous chest, and entered the hut. Fuck. The neighbors gathered in front, admiring the horse and cart. After waiting impatiently for Laba and Labina to reappear, the villagers began to jest. He had rushed to her like a buck to a goat, they said, and cold water should be poured over them. Suddenly the doors of the hut opened, and the crowd gasped with astonishment. On the threshold stood handsome Laba in a suit of unimaginable splendor. He wore a striped silk shirt with a stark white collar around his tanned neck and a garish tie. His soft flannel suit begged to be touched. A satin handkerchief stuck out of his breast pocket like a flower. To this was added a pair of black lacquered boots and a crowning glory, a gold watch hanging from his breast pocket. The peasants gaped in awe. Nothing like this had happened in the history of the village. Usually the inhabitants wore homespun jackets, trousers sewed together from 2 lengths of cloth, and boots of rough tan leather nailed to a thick wooden sole. Laba extracted from his chest innumerable colorful jackets of unusual cut, trousers, shirts, and patent leather shoes, shining with such luster they could serve as mirrors and handkerchiefs, ties, socks, and underclothes. Handsome Laba became the supreme object of local interest. Unusual stories went around about him. Various surmises were made about the origin of all these priceless objects. Labina was showered with questions she could not answer, for Laba gave only vague replies, contributing even more to the growth of the legend. There's a word over here that I liked. That was right here. Fuck. The fuck did I say? There's a word right here that I liked. Luster? Yeah, such luster. I don't know, I like luster. During church services, no one looked at the priest or the altar. They all watched the right-hand corner of the nave, where handsome Laba sat stiffly with his wife in his black satin suit and flowered shirt. On his wrist, he wore a glittering watch at which he would glance ostentatiously. This fucking bug. There it is right here. Fucking bug. The priest's vestments, once the very acme of ornateness, now seemed as dull as a wintry sky. The people sitting near Laba delighted in the unusual fragrances that wafted from him. Labina confided that they derived from a number of little bottles and jars. So he's outshining the fucking priest. After the mass, the crowd moved into the courtyard of the presbytery and ignored the vicar, who tried to attract their attention. They waited for Laba. He walked toward the exit with a loose, confident stride, his heels loudly tapping the church floor. The people respectfully gave way to him. The richest peasants approached and greeted him familiarly. This fucking thing, dude. This fucking bug, dude. So they greeted him familiarly and invited him to their homes for dinners in his honor. Without inclining his head, Laba casually shook the hands outstretched to him. Women barred his way and, heedless of Labina's presence, hiked their skirts up so their thighs showed and pulled at their dresses to make their breasts more prominent. Handsome Laba no longer worked in the fields. He even refused to help his wife in the house. He passed his days bathing in the lake. He hung his multicolored clothing on a tree near the shore. Nearby, excited women watched his naked muscular body. It was said that Laba allowed some of them to touch him in the shadow of the bushes, and that they were ready to commit shameful acts with him, for which a terrible retribution might be exacted. In the afternoon, when the villagers returned from the field sweating and gray with dust, they passed handsome Laba, sauntering the other way, carefully stepping on the firmest part of the road so as not to soil his shoes, adjusting his tie, and polishing his watch with a pink handkerchief. In the evenings, horses would be sent for Laba, and he would drive off to receptions, often in places dozens of miles away. Labina stayed home half dead with exhaustion and humiliation, caring for the farm, the horse, and her husband's treasures. For handsome Laba, time had stopped, but Labina aged rapidly, her breasts sagging and her thighs growing flabby. A year passed. One autumn day, Labina returned from the fields, expecting to find her husband in the attic with all his treasures. The attic was Laba's exclusive realm, and he carried on his breast, along with a medallion of the Holy Virgin, the key to the large padlock securing its door. But now the house was absolutely still. No smoke poured from the chimney, and there was no sound of Laba singing as he changed into one of his warmer suits. Labina, frightened, rushed into the hut. The door to the attic was open. She climbed up to it. What she saw horrified her. On the floor lay the chest with its lid torn off and its whitish bottom visible. A human body dangled above the chest. Her husband now hung on the large hook where his suits used to hang. Handsome Laba, swaying like a slowed-down pendulum, was suspended by a floral patterned necktie. There was a hole in the roof through which the thief had carried away the contents of the chest. The thin rays of the setting sun illuminated the pallid face of handsome Laba and the bluish tongue sticking out of his mouth. All around, iridescent flies murmured. Labina guessed what had happened when Laba had returned from bathing in the lake to put on his parade suit. He found the hole in the attic roof and the empty chest. All his fine clothes were gone, only a single necktie remained, lying like a severed flower in the trampled straw. Laba's reason for living had disappeared with the contents of his chest. There was an end to weddings at which no one looked at the groom, an end to burials at which handsome Laba would meet the worshipful gaze of the crowd as he stood above the open grave, an end to proud self-display in the lake and the touch of eager female hands. With the careful, deliberate movement which no one else in the village could imitate, Laba had put on his necktie for the last time. Then he had pulled the empty chest toward him and reached for the hook in the ceiling. Labina never discovered how her husband had acquired his treasures. He never referred to the period of his absence. No one knew where he had been, what he had done, what price he had paid for all those goods. All the village knew was what the loss of his things cost him. Neither the thief nor any of the stolen objects was ever found. While I was still there, rumors circulated that the thief was a cuckolded husband or fiancé. Others suspected that some insanely jealous woman was responsible. Many people in the village suspected Labina herself. When she heard of this accusation, her face grew livid, her hands shook, and a rancid smell of bitterness came from her mouth. Her fingers clawed. She would hurl herself at the accuser, and the onlookers would have to separate them. Labina would return home, drink herself into a stupor, and hold me close to her breast, weeping and sobbing. During one of these fights, her heart burst. When I saw several men carrying her dead body to the hut, I knew I had to flee. I filled my comet with smoldering embers, reached under the bed, and grabbed the precious necktie hidden there by Labina, the necktie on which handsome Laba had hung himself and left. It was common belief that the rope of a suicide brings good luck. I hoped I would never lose the necktie. Damn, it's one of my favorite fucking stories so far in this book. Could be like its own little tale, you know what I'm saying? Honestly, it's one of my favorites so far. "14. Named Laba, right? Labina and Laba. Labina. Story of pretty sad. Now I could kill this fucking little bug, dude. Fuck.